The pastor's son who waited 20 years for the pulpit on September 19, 2025, inside a packed sanctuary in Brooklyn, a 72-year-old man who built one of the most powerful churches in America handed his pulpit to his son. The congregation stood. Some cried. And within hours, the internet did what the internet always does. It called it nepotism. A rich man's kid inheriting the family business, except the family business happens to be a 37,000-member megachurch with a television studio, a school, a credit union, and enough political weight that the New York Times once called the father the power pastor of New York City. But here's the thing, almost nobody reporting the story bothered to check. The son they were calling a nepo pastor had already spent 2 decades in that building, doing jobs nobody photographs for the church bulletin. Before he ever preached a Sunday sermon as senior pastor, Jamaal Bernard ran security for thousands of worshipers every single week. He balanced budgets. He built an entire campus from a folding table and an empty room into a functioning church home for thousands of people. So today, we're going to actually look at what happened at Christian Cultural Center, why the succession happened the way it did, and why the story of Jamaal Bernard says something bigger about where American megachurches are heading next. Let's start with the man he's replacing, because you cannot understand the son without understanding the shadow he grew up in. Dr. A.R. Bernard founded Christian Cultural Center in Brooklyn back in 1978. Over almost 5 decades, he built it from a small congregation into the largest evangelical church in New York City. A church so large it doesn't really function like a church anymore in the traditional sense. It functions more like an institution. Tens of thousands of members, multiple campuses, a media operation, a charter school, a credit union, real political influence, the kind that gets a pastor invited into rooms with mayors and governors and gets him described in the national press as a genuine power broker. That is the scale of what Jamaal Bernard was born into. Not a small family church he could quietly inherit. An empire with moving parts, a payroll, a public safety operation, and a reputation his father had spent a lifetime building brick by brick since the late 70s. And this is exactly why the nepotism headlines missed the actual story. Because when a founder's child takes over a church this size, there are really 2 very different ways it can happen. One way, the son shows up, gets ordained, and within a few years is handed the keys because of his last name. The other way, the son spends decades working every unglamorous job in the operation, proving to thousands of members and dozens of staff that he can actually run the place, long before anyone puts him behind the pulpit permanently. Jamaal Bernard's path was the second one, and the timeline actually backs that up, long before his installation as senior pastor. He held the title of Chief of Operations at Christian Cultural Center. He also served as Director of Public Safety. Think about what that actually means for a congregation of 37,000 people spread across multiple locations. It means logistics. It means crowd flow, emergency planning, staffing coordination, budgets, facilities, security briefings, the unglamorous infrastructure that has to work perfectly every single week so that thousands of people can walk in, worship, and walk back out safely. That's not a ceremonial title handed to a founder's kid to keep him busy. That is the operational backbone of an organization the size of a mid-sized company, and Jamaal ran pieces of it for years before he ever wore the senior pastor's title. Then there's the piece of his URSM that might be the most convincing argument against the nepotism narrative, Long Island. Back in February of 2015, Christian Cultural Center launched a new campus out on Long Island, and Jamaal Bernard was named senior pastor there, not of the flagship Brooklyn campus his father built, but of a brand new satellite location that, at the time, was essentially starting from nothing. No built-in congregation, no inherited momentum, just a new building and a mandate to grow it. For roughly a decade, Jamaal built that campus himself. He preached there every week, developed the ministry programs, and grew the membership from the ground up in a market that had no guaranteed loyalty to the Bernard name just because his father's name was on the marquee in Brooklyn. In a very real sense, Long Island was Jamaal's public audition, playing out over 10 full years in front of an entire congregation that could see, week after week, whether this man could actually lead. If Jamaal Bernard had failed at Long Island, there's a strong argument the succession conversation never happens. Instead, he grew it, sustained it, and used that campus as proof of concept for exactly the kind of large-scale ministry leadership his father eventually handed him citywide. So, by the time September 2025 arrived, and Dr. A.R. Bernard stood in that Brooklyn sanctuary and formally installed his son as the new senior pastor of Christian Cultural Center. The reason behind the moment included a decade running his own campus, years leading operations and public safety for the entire organization, founding the church's C3 youth ministry, and leading a ministry called Unapologetic Ambassadors for Christ. Dr. Bernard, in his remarks that day, said Jamaal had spent his life preparing for the moment. The son, for his part, addressed the congregation and asked them to stand with him in faith and serve with joy. It's worth saying plainly, this succession wasn't unique in isolation. Just months earlier, Bishop T.D. Jakes had handed senior pastoral duties at the Potter's House in Dallas to his daughter, Sarah Jakes Roberts, and her husband. Around the same period, Pastor Tony Evans passed leadership of Oak Cliff Bible Fellowship to his son, Jonathan Evans. Three of America's most prominent Black megachurches within roughly the same window, all navigating the same question. What happens to an institution this large when the founder eventually has to let go? Critics call it a trend toward church dynasties. Defenders call it the most responsible way to protect an institution's mission when the alternative is an outside hire who doesn't understand the culture, the community, or the members by name. Now here's where the story gets more human, and honestly, more interesting than the succession politics. Because leading an organization this size nearly broke Jamaal Bernard physically before it made him famous. In his own words, shared publicly, he described years of treating exhaustion as a badge of spiritual honor, telling himself that being tired simply meant he was faithful, that the calling demanded it. Slowly, that exhaustion became his baseline. His energy dropped, his motivation faded, and then came a diagnosis he could no longer explain away: high blood pressure. He's described that moment as the point where he had to confront an uncomfortable truth, that he was pouring everything into his spiritual life while quietly neglecting the actual body he needed to carry out that calling. He's talked about maintaining his car, his phone, his home, while ignoring the one vehicle that mattered most. And one sentence, he says, kept surfacing in his mind afterward: you only get one of these. That single health scare became the start of a completely different kind of discipline for him, not inspiration-driven, but necessity-driven. He started training. He built structure into his physical life the same way he'd built structure into the church's operations for years. And what's notable is that he didn't keep this quiet or private the way older generations of pastors often did with personal weakness. He turned it into public teaching material, framing physical health explicitly as a form of spiritual stewardship, the idea that the body carrying out God's work deserves the same discipline and maintenance as the ministry itself. For a congregation used to hearing sermons about tithing and prayer and scripture, hearing their new senior pastor talk openly about blood pressure medication and gym discipline was something different. It was vulnerability, from a pulpit that historically didn't traffic in vulnerability. And that vulnerability is really the through line of everything Jamaal Bernard represents for the next era of Christian Cultural Center. For most of the 20th century, and honestly a good chunk of the 21st, the megachurch pastor archetype was almost untouchable. Polished, composed, a figure on a stage under studio lighting who represented certainty, not doubt. Jamaal Bernard is deliberately building something different. He hosts an interview series called Off Script, where the entire premise is unfiltered, unpolished conversation, moving past the pulpit persona into real talk with thought leaders, culture makers, and everyday people wrestling with life's hardest questions. That format alone is a signal. American Christianity right now is dealing with a genuine exodus of younger believers, a well-documented cultural moment often called faith deconstruction, where people who grew up inside evangelical churches start openly questioning the beliefs and institutions they inherited. Many pastors have responded to that trend defensively, treating any doubt as a threat to be corrected. Jamaal Bernard's approach, at least in tone, leans the other direction, creating space for real questions instead of shutting them down, which is precisely the kind of posture that research on the deconstruction movement suggests actually keeps people engaged rather than pushing them further away. Whether that strategy fully works long-term is still an open question. And it's fair to say reasonable people, including plenty inside evangelical circles, disagree about whether more transparency from pastors builds trust or simply invites more scrutiny. But it's a clear and deliberate departure from his father's generation of pulpit leadership, and it appears to be a calculated bet on what keeps a 37,000 member church relevant for the next 50 years rather than just the next 5. So what does Christian Cultural Center actually look like today under this new structure? It is no longer a single Brooklyn church with a famous founder. It's a genuine multi-campus operation, with locations that now include the flagship in Brooklyn, the Long Island campus Jamaal spent a decade building, plus campuses in Orlando and Atlanta. Dr. A.R. Bernard hasn't disappeared from the organization. He's transitioned into the role of chairman of Christian Cultural Center Global, a shift that lets him focus on international growth and long-range strategy while his son runs the day-to-day and week-to-week leadership of the ministry itself. It's a fairly elegant structural answer to the succession problem, actually. The founder doesn't vanish and take his institutional knowledge with him, and he doesn't hover over his son's shoulder, undermining the new leadership either. He moves upward and outward into a role that uses his decades of relationships and credibility on a global stage, while creating genuine room for his son to lead the core organization without a shadow standing directly behind the pulpit every Sunday. If you zoom out from Christian Cultural Center specifically, what you're really watching play out is a preview of a much bigger reckoning coming for American megachurches over the next decade. The generation of pastors who built these massive institutions in the 70s, 80s, and 90s from nothing are now in their 70s and 80s themselves. And almost none of them built a formal succession plan the way a public company would. Church, T.D. Jakes, and now A.R. Bernard have made headlines for handling that transition inside the family. Other prominent ministries have handled it far more messily, with public fights, fractured congregations, or institutions that simply collapsed once the founder's personal charisma left the building. What makes the Christian Cultural Center case genuinely worth studying isn't just that the succession happened peacefully. It's that the son spent close to 2 decades earning it through actual operational proof, public safety, church operations, and a full decade single-handedly building a satellite campus from scratch before he ever inherited a title. Whether or not you agree with hereditary church leadership as a model, and reasonable people land on very different sides of that question, the receipts on Jamaal Bernard's specific path are hard to dismiss as pure nepotism. He didn't skip the line. He spent the better part of 20 years standing in it. So here's the actual question worth sitting with as this new era at Christian Cultural Center begins. Is this the model other megachurches should follow? Grooming a successor for decades inside the organization, testing them in the unglamorous roles before ever handing them the microphone? Or does hereditary succession, no matter how earned, eventually create the same dynasty problem critics are worried about, just with better public relations behind it? Christian Cultural Center's next chapter, under Senior Pastor Jamaal Bernard, is going to be one of the most closely watched experiments in modern American ministry, precisely because it sits right at that unresolved tension. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments what you think: earned succession or dynasty with extra steps. And if you want more deep dives into the institutions, money, and power structures behind American religion, make sure you're subscribed, because this is exactly the kind of story we're going to keep digging into.